challenging at this time. The biggest enemy is actually the siesta in this sense, so, but we will definitely overcome that as well, and we'll win. So we talked about history and various aspects, and etc. So the Yom Kippur War had significant impact and ramification, exceeding the military and political ramification. This war is a watershed line, including the economical aspect in the state of Israel. And what I would like to emphasize in this particular conference, the Yom Kippur War occupies an honorable space in the global history due to the oil crisis and everything that came afterwards. So I would like to very shortly though address those. How much time do I have, Tali? Do I have 15 minutes? What am I going to do in 15 minutes? Too much time for me, really. And let's begin. So first of all, I would like to quote from the same period of time. 1973 symbolizes the unprecedented watershed mark after the war. It's a breaking point. It's a period of Yom Kippur in economical development, the lost decade that Dan Amidror mentioned actually this concept in his address. What is this lost decade? And how can we accurately present it, what caused it, and etc. So I would like to begin from the facts, the very facts in the sense, and the figures in order to understand what exactly was the intention in this term. The first term that we see on the board as summarizing, or some kind of figure that summarizes so many different things, is a growth, economical growth of a state. Obviously, we hear this term very often, and I would like to start from 1965 in the state of Israel. The elders amongst us will remember that 1966 in the state of Israel was a very deep recession, unprecedented one that the state of Israel never knew. And as a recession, until today, it remained as a groundbreaking event. Since afterwards, the state of Israel, in a different context of various crises of global nature, we knew as well that we had dips in growth, but not as a result of internal recession that was completely made in Israel. And this was, in fact, people left Israel, there was negative immigration. This is this figure, this drop in growth of the state of Israel as a result of this recession in 1967 opened within the same recession. And in fact, it was a harsh year for the state of Israel in the very beginning of this year. The national stagnation, the almost depression, and this awaiting existential anxiety that spread all over that we will be perished very soon. And the miracle of the Six-Day War happened. And this leap in everything, including the growth. And then we are beginning this period of time of an average growth of 11.9%, which is an imaginary number. China, and its zenith of the best years of its economical growth, scratched this number from the bottom. An average of 11.9% of growth, unprecedented in economical history. It's amazing record, prosperity, immigration into Israel. We are omnipotent, and at that moment, there's an attrition war in the background, but it's somehow been swallowed by this success. This tremendous success. It's extremely important to remember that a moment before, on the brink of, and then the Yom Kippur War erupts and opens the lost decade. The meaning is, this is a tremendous gap in growth. Growth of 11.9%, we drop immediately to 3.3%. This is not a minor gap. This is a tremendous gap. when the population in the State of Israel grew at that period of time at the rate of more than 2% a year. So the GDP in Israel almost didn't change. The level of living in the State of Israel absolutely didn't change at that period of time for the decade, in fact. We do forget the first Lebanese war. That happened, long ago, during this lost decade, in fact. What happened afterwards? We start to clean up the house, and then we open a quite continuous period of time of reforms. We won't have time to get into reforms, but this, in fact, represents Israel at its best. We are cleaning up the house. We're building an economy that will lead to the startup nation after everything that happened to us during this lost decade. During that period of time, within it, there is another figure that is very important and explained partially at least, the red over there. It's the inflation in the State of Israel. Exponential is not just COVID, friends. Look at that. This is the mother of exponential growth, not the virus. And the inflation is a disease, it's a lethal disease, malignant. If you do not manage to curtail it in time, it will explode exponentially and will burn down everything around. So the inflation reached the pace of, it says 450%, but there are people that actually claim that it's even 500, but does it matter? It doesn't really. For the younger people among us, those who don't even remember that period of time, today we're mad about an inflation of 4% or something of that sort. And this is, oh my God, exactly, this is absolutely a catastrophe. But this is 500% of inflation, 400% of inflation. So if you would like to have a snapshot of a complete loss of control, this was not a force majeure. Such an inflation, this is handmade outcome. This is all handmade result of a certain way of management. The central bank didn't have any independence, and it's important to remember that. This is a fiscal loss of control in the State of Israel, absolutely that. So inflation doesn't happen as some kind of punishment from God. This is absolute fiscal abandon. It will influence all of us all the time. At every given moment of our minutes, will twist our economic decisions, will distort everything we're doing, and will divert resources in order to defend ourselves from this inflation instead of serving other needs. This is a complete abandon on behalf of the government of Israel and the central bank, and this is in 85. This is a turning point, and we start to rebuild our sanity. This is something that is important for you to remember. Another very interesting number is the ratio between the debt and the output, how much the state owes to, what do you mean owes? State owes money? Yeah, it does actually. If you do have a budget of the state with a deficit, how will you pay for this deficit? Obviously, you need to loan money from whom? From the public, obviously through the bonds. They didn't even ask you that much, really. They were mandatory bonds, if you remember, operations, yeah. So, and you loan from others abroad if they're willing to loan you money. So this debt, in fact, they pile up. Obviously, they're piling up, and then at a certain point, one of the indexes is what is the height of this pile. How tall is the pile of your debt in relation to your output, to how much you can actually produce and generate. When we started here, as you can see here, that's a period of time of 65. And this is a debt of 60% of our output, which is not that bad, really. Here we are already at 150%, 150%. So 74%, as you can see here, 76, I think. We are 150% of our output. This is a catastrophe, my dear friends. 150% of the output of our economy. That means that the state of Israel can actually might fail or considered to be as a country that may go bankrupt. So that's what it means, in fact. We might not be able to comply with our liabilities and commitments. And some countries do go bankrupt. This is, trust me, country from which I come. We have an experience. It's our expertise to go bankrupt as a state. So this is where we were. And again and again and again, the process begins, a continuous process of decreasing that to the level that is acceptable, a level of sanity that allows us to actually manage a country. What causes such a ratio, really? There are different factors. There's not one factor, but obviously it's already been mentioned here. The very high expenditures on security. What is the percentage of security expenditures of the state of Israel? How much do we dedicate out of this pie? What is the size of this pie we dedicate to security? You have to see that there is a leap in 67 to very height, to very significant height. More than 20% of output is being spent on security. And this is the attrition war, of course. That's the reason. Of course, it wasn't just, kind of free lunch. They had to pay for it, and it drops on the eve of the Yom Kippur War. And then it jumps up and reaches 35%, but again, then measurements were less exact than now, but it's more than 1/3 of the output of the state economy is being spent on security. What does it even mean? England, for example, during the Second World War, when the whole state was recruited for the military effort, but it was the whole empire, not just Britain, in fact, the whole British Empire. I'm talking about the UK. Those numbers are for UK versus the GDP of the UK. So this is the GDP or just of United Britain. More than 50% of the GDP of UK was dedicated to the war effort. Let's look at that. Let's take it with a grain of salt because, again, that's the best comparison we can actually find. But let's look at that. We reached 1/3 of GDP dedicated to military expenditures. It's inconceivable today. We have less than 6% of expenditures, 5%. Again, it really depends on how you measure it. That's true. What is correct? So we have certain reservations here. The significant part of it was not on the local consumption, but it was an export, a military export from the United States that has been funded by various generous loans and later on by various grants. So that would not be true to say that we took this 1/3 of our GDP from this pie we manufacture. We wouldn't be able to comply with that. It's impossible. But it's a tremendous burden upon the shoulders of the nation that was upon the economy of Israel. And even if we'll look at the decline during this lost decade, we're still at the levels that are quite high, really, of the ratio of debt GDP. About 20% of the whole GDP was dedicated to the military needs, which is, again, it's a burden you can't really comply with in a lengthy period of time for a long term. So we have to state that what you do have here on the board, and it's been mentioned here, I think, but not enough to my taste, really. There was a tremendous growth. There was the diagram someone did pulled up of the regular military forces, the resources, but what really was increased was the reservist force. But the reservist force, so how is it possible that actually we increase so much the reservist force? Who is doing reservist force? Those who serve, so it doesn't really change. It does change, really, because the length of the reservist service, there were less people exempt from the reservist service, so there was a significantly higher recruitment of reservists and the regular service as well. Demographics is demographics, but not everyone who were conscripted every year served the full term, or not everyone went to the military service. There was a civic service as well. They didn't call it that. For different national missions. Before 73, they had it. So there is tremendous growth in the regular military force and the reservist military force. This growth obviously had to be funded as well. So it's the military capital, the equipment, and etc. partially was imported from the United States and through the military aid of the Americans. And here, I would like to emphasize that it's very important. We received a gift or loans that were very convenient. Why would you mind that? No, this is not how it works. You always pay for a gift you get. Each tank you receive should be maintained. The airplanes, they should be maintained. The pilot jets, they cost money to keep them operable. Those tremendous current expenses that are not part of the American aid. When you're increasing your resources, you need to maintain those resources. Those things were mentioned today, but indirectly. We need to delve into depth of this topic. To what extent the military, that almost doubled itself by size and by number of equipment and munition, to what extent the military, in fact, is built in order to fight the previous war, or is it the next war it's destined to fight? There's a lot written about this particular question, a significant number of claims, significant part of this investment, tremendous investment that was such a heavy price for our economy in the state of Israel. It cost so much to us. But a significant part of it went to the parking lot of rusted vehicles. And I'm putting it here in front of you. Again, with certain concern, but with certain pain as well. So it's actually parked at the peace with Egypt, a certain time after the war. Things were said here as well, but still, this regular military, the divisions. Did you talk about that? I think you did talk about directorates, etc. We talked about that privately, at least, about the size and the scale of the military conscription and the reservists that were not properly calculated. So the military allowed itself to recruit the reservist service even when not needed. So there was a whole process. And it wasn't really clear why we were facing the past instead of facing the future. So, I mentioned American military aid. So on the eve of the war, the American aid was of $300 million a year. It was not annually because, again, it wasn't a steady stream. It became 1 billion afterwards, and billion for Hungary during the first part of 1980. So do the adjustments, of course, what is billion for Hungary then? It's not that far from what we're actually receiving today from the Americans. So the American aid, again, obviously was vital to the state of Israel. There is no any doubt, not even shadow of a doubt, quality-wise and etc. But again, you know, all of those things, they have two sides of the coin, in fact, and there were definitely ramifications until today. They're quite doubtful influences. To what extent we actually needed that, certain aspects of it, maybe, because we got used to certain things and etc. because of that. Another factor that wasn't mentioned, again, or mentioned enough, that contributed significantly to this, I want actually kind of to go back and here, because this is in fact the most important part of this slide. What really contributed to this lost decade was no doubt this political shock and earthquake, I would say, that happened in the state of Israel following the Yom Kippur War. What is following the Yom Kippur War? So the war didn't bring the shock itself, but it did accelerate it and contributed to the end of the hegemonic rule of Mapai, even before the creation of the State of Israel. In 1977, Likud came to power. So no doubt it would have happened anyway, of course, but the war was an accelerating factor that pushed it forward. And of course, this is a phenomenon, by the way, that I'm allowed to say here, a statement. It's a positive occurrence, really, because democracy will become unhealthy, that the party, it doesn't matter which party, will be staying at power for too long of a time. We're well familiar with those manifestations, of course, but what happened, and that is a very challenging aspect, that when the government was created in 1977, under the slogan, in economical social aspect, let's benefit the people. Well, sounds good, right? Who doesn't want benefits for the people? We all want benefits for the people. Do you want any damage to the people? Obviously not. But the interpretation given to this particular, under those circumstances, was that we need to open the faucet, the fiscal faucet, let it run really. At the same time, when you saw where the expenditures on security were, which is impossible, ladies and gentlemen, it's against the laws of physics. You cannot fill it up and empty it at the same time. You can't have it all. And the result, the connection of the political change that came with this, let's bring benefits to the people, with tremendous rise in security expenditures. That's exactly what brought us to the hyperinflation in the state of Israel. It's not one factor. We need to understand that. Another thing, which is also quite interesting development, in fact, this political change, the political shift in the state of Israel came with the ideological shift as well. Let's put the end not just to Mapai, but also to this socialistic approach, the centralized approach that, which should have happened, of course. But how should it happen? How do you need to lead to some kind of regime change? You need to do that smartly, gradually, and with the consent and responsibility and consensus. In 1977, it didn't happen in such a form. By the way, it's difficult to do that. It's very hard, really. It's challenging. And there are enough of examples after the collapse of the Soviet Union when countries were going through this revolution and change of the regime, economical change from communism into something else. This is hard to manage it, trust me. I'm coming from... Do not interpret my words wrongly. Any transition is hard. But what is unique was this particular combination, after this blow of the Yom Kippur War and everything that came with this. And something else happened in addition, which was in fact the oil crisis. We forgot about that completely, didn't we? The price of oil jumped from $4 per barrel to $12, 4 times higher, overnight, in fact. OPEC countries, in fact, they did two things. They imposed an embargo on oil upon the United States and 3 or 4 other countries, Western countries that supported Israel. An embargo continued until March of '74, by the way. And then they removed the embargo, but the prices risen, and that opened a completely different era in the world of the energy crisis, the world since the Second World War just leaped economically and enjoying the cheap energy that significant part of it came from the Middle East, and suddenly this whole business was over. And that was a tremendous crisis. And in the world, and especially in the West, it led to the phenomenon that today, this phenomenon is stagflation. What is stagflation? We do feel it a little bit today, the combination of 2 words. Stagflation, it's stagnation and, stagnation and inflation. So this is an economical stagnation and an inflation at the same time. So usually those things doesn't really work together well. But here it entwined because of the energy crisis, a horrible period of time, a really bad one. And that hit us hard. This phenomenon hit us in 2 ways. First of all, economically speaking, because Israel didn't suffer that much of the crisis, of oil crisis, because we'd never relied upon the Arabic neft anyway. We did buy from Iran mostly, Mexico, and etc. So we didn't really feel any difference, right? We didn't have a problem. But then obviously we're not buying from Iran the oil any longer, but we still have, there was still a rise in the price of oil, but it did actually, was the impact of stagflation in the world because international trade slowed down and everything changed, and it was a backlash, obviously. One of the most interesting things is that the public in the state of Israel, you would think, there would have been protests in the streets, on Kaplan Street, for example, but this is what happened. No, but it was absolutely not. Majority of the public, significant part of the public in the state of Israel, didn't feel any of that, those numbers. So how is it possible? Why is it so? So well, it's possible. Of course it is possible. Why did it happen? Because at the same time, the state of Israel had a full employment. There was no unemployment. How is it possible there was no unemployment? Well, the public sector was very, very, very overgrown, was well developed. A lot of employees were absorbed into the public sector, including to the security sector as well. So there's no unemployment, which is good, obviously. Secondly, the state of Israel, we invented something called actually adjustment to the index. If there's inflation, no problem. Everything is adjusted. The prices are coming up. Everything is rising. Your salary, everything is rising. But again, we invented here basically something that ruined us later on, because this index feeds the inflation, in fact. So this is a spiral again. But in fact, at the very same moment, you don't feel it momentarily. You don't feel the pain of this particular blow. And there's also a bubble in the state of Israel that evolved in real estate. It evolved in, obviously, the bank stocks. There was a tremendous crisis that actually caused the collapse of banks in the state of Israel. And the banks were nationalized in Israel. We forgot about that in 1983. The bank nationalization, the very fact that the public didn't feel the pain of the economical crisis at that period of time, again contributed to this particular growth of the crisis and the length of the crisis. So, as I said, there were global manifestations, the stagnation, etc. We also need to put it into perspective, because something similar is quite happening right now in the world. The Yom Kippur War is the end of 3 decades of unstoppable highway growth in the world. There was a Cold War, of course, but in the West, that was the constant growth, prosperity, miniature globalization within the Western world, not with the East yet, but it's a miniature, it's an economical prosperity. Very nice one, really. And it did happen, and suddenly this energy crisis, stagflation, and the Cold War that reached its zenith, and we talked about that, it continues to escalate. And I would like to create some kind of parallel here, a bit of a parallel. To a certain extent, until a few years ago, we were on a highway of 3 decades from then. From the collapse of the Soviet Union, we enjoyed this highway of globalization. The world is growing. End of history. Wonderful. All hunky-dory. And since then, suddenly, the conflict between the United States and China, this confrontation between the United States and China that has been mentioned, the energy crisis, a new one. We thought it's so outdated, but it's war in Ukraine, which is wake-up call for all of us. And COVID, of course, absolutely. So in fact, again, Benny mentioned the spiral of history. And we are witnessing such a process. I would like to finish with one statement. No doubt what happened to us then from an economical perspective, unfortunately, today is not in public awareness. It's been forgotten. I have some kind of very vague memory of something, I don't know, the lost decade or whatever. You don't celebrate 50 years, 40 years of lost decade. There won't be an event of that sort, right? No one will be celebrating or commemorating those, lessons. No one will be learning lessons from this. But what I do want to mention, that this period of time, I talked about actual arrogance. Yeah, there was arrogance, economical arrogance. And I can smell it. I smell this arrogance of Startup Nation. I can smell it in the air, this arrogance of the Startup Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is resilient. No one is immune of those processes. And I wish that we will learn this lesson. God forbid we'll fall into this trap of this economical arrogance and we'll find ourselves trapped in 5 years of loss. Well, obviously, thank you, Professor Trajtenberg, and without further ado, unnecessary ado. We will be leaping with Dr. Shafran Gittelman. She's a researcher of relations of society and the military. And since then and now, this is just 15 minutes. And just a second, please. I have a little bit of a technical problem. I need a flagging lamp.
We'll talk about the relationship between the army and society. In 15 minutes, we'll try to cover a whole world. In fact, because everything that is said now is covered, comes into the same subject. On the contrary, we're at the heart of the problem. I must say one sentence written by Manuel, her husband, deceased. He wrote about Ben Gurion. He was the 5th Chief of Staff of Israel. In 2008, he was out of the army for 10 months. I want to relate to the Israeli people, with the army being one part of it. The civilian leadership must be totally looking control and not one only from the military aspect. Let's talk about that tension. First of all, I think it's a perfect quote. There are many aspects of the relationship between the civilian and the military circles. We must say about the army, the military, that no doubt there's a certain void. Doesn't really tell us what the role of the army is. And this is something from the point of view of the challenges that the army confronts. What are the things that the army is supposed to do and what are the things that it shouldn't do? When we talk about the basic law of the army, there are many different interpretations about what the army should do. Of course, protection and national security. But lately we have talked about Corona in the army, we've talked about the ultra-Orthodox and the army. The question is, what is the intention in our defining the army and its functions? Historically, from the description point of view, what do we expect from the army? What should be its force? The army has tried to do everything it could, anything it was asked to do. But when we talk about things that are more in the realm of the military, things may look less defensive. Today, in a way, we go back to the initial notion of what the army should do. Consider the Corona, the COVID, for example. The army could help with the COVID crisis. Something we touched in the first forum, but we did not really talk much about it. There's no doubt that the army can help in many fields. one of the big challenges of today. In a way, considering that the IDF can be the source of the solution of solving the social problems is not a very realistic one, because even though the army is very important, it is not responsible for the civilian targets. And we should really try and decide if that's what we want, if that's the best thing for us. If we come back to the Yom Kippur War and the lack of confidence between the army and the political circle, how do we conceive that today? We should try, as they say, to be not an army which has a state, but a state that has an army. The political decision makers seem to have today some sort of a trust problem with the army. In fact, what happens is a difference, a gap between what the expectations from the army are and what really happens in the field. And this also seems to be emphasized in the eyes of the public. We also have the impression that failures of the army have been real things. In the Yom Kippur War, the lack of confidence, of trust was rather towards the political circles and not really towards the army. In fact, the problem was with the whole population. It was something tactical. If we talk about the trust of the civilians in general towards the army, we see that since there is no army without the people, and vice versa, they are interdependent, and the public can see the difference between criticism of the army and its management and the need for the army and the love people usually have towards the army. Now, they go into all kinds of directions, and with the necessary care, I must say that there is some sort of a lack of confidence, which is very specific. In general, the public is very much trusting the army. And we are right now in the face of a different thing because of the political situation. There's no doubt that the army has always been an element of change in Israeli society. We are a bit sentimental about that, but lately we've been talking about the service of women soldiers in the most elite unit of the IDF. How is that managed? Is it the army trying to give such positions to women? Or is it because of pressure from outside? In fact, the situation in which we are right now is also partly a definition or a consequence of what happened after the Yom Kippur War. the situation of women in order to build the army properly after the war, we realized that we really needed also women soldiers to be in places where they were not present until then. And it was not before of the equality principle. It is important, of course, equality is important, but it was a more general trend of simply opening more and more situations and positions to women soldiers within the frame of the needs of the army, of the IDF. And also this was specified by the court, by the Supreme Court. Another thing also related to that is the service of the ultra-Orthodox. There's no doubt that the country, the army needs soldiers, and enlisting at least part of the Hasidim is something that should be done. Now, this is a delicate situation because a law is in the making concerning that the enlisting of the ultra-Orthodox. Should it be decided by law that all those who reach a certain age have to go to the army, or there is also the reality that we live in concerning the Haredim and also concerning women? We must differentiate between the situations. The fact is that the army doesn't need all the Haredim, so why insist on enlisting all of them? These are things that have been considered, but the same question can be asked in a different way. Maybe the army doesn't need my son in its service. About women, it's a beautiful thing to hear that the most elite unit will also have women fighters. There are enough reasons to try to decide in this direction or that one. Again, in order to tie things to the Yom Kippur War, we see that for many years, even though our culture is changing, there is something that did not exist before the Yom Kippur War and has appeared after the war. We have the element of the readiness to criticize, to doubt, to somehow go against the holy cows, and criticizing and asking questions. And let's talk, for example, about the bereaved parents. There's no doubt that the Yom Kippur War brought a change against that. For example, the way people relate to that. Until then, the position was in general that it was good to die for the country, and accepting the fact that people died for their country. After the Yom Kippur War, this has somehow changed, and people ask themselves a bit differently, was it really necessary? It was not like you go, if necessary, die for your country. Now it's about, we're talking about songs and poems, things that express a different attitude against dying for the country. There was, of course, before the Yom Kippur, there was also criticism. It's not that we are completely changing our position concerning that, but there's no doubt that the attitude has somehow changed. The question is not if it is right to send your kids to the army or not. Even today, we believe that a bereaved family is in a difficult situation. We have no doubt about the need to protect the country and to fight for it. This is something we love and we also respect and really always accept and love the bereaved families. But the criticism is more vocal. At the same time, there's no doubt that the War of Yom Kippur has brought some change, but it was not a total change. It's not possible to talk about reserve duty. In fact, considering the bad starting point of the war, there's no doubt that the success of the war was the presence, the enlisting of the reserve forces that changed the course of the war. There was no doubt that they came by themselves. Some of them paid for it with their lives. And in those days, the reserve duty, and today we have people who fly to the States in order to save the country in their way due to the political situation. In fact, the reserve forces were very important during the war, and today they are politically very strong. Today everything is political. Aryeh is not here with us, but there are many myths concerning the reservists. In the parliament, I've participated in quite a few. It's a fact that when people are called for reserve duty, not 100%, but 110% of them come. Everybody has so far come for reserve duty. And this is not because of you said that when you talk about I don't want to repeat those words, but there's a difference between the reservist who is a civilian, who knows as a civilian what he has to do when he knows that the country is fighting for its survival, and what I think about my country being inexistent when I wake up tomorrow morning. Where do we live? What are we afraid of? And what do we do about it? When I'm not afraid that the state of Israel will be in a position of non-existence tomorrow morning, I'm rather talking about what kind of an identity will my country have. So the reservists are also of various types. The thing is that what is the price the reservists who make or do not make a political use of their duty, what is their expectation? Anyone who joins the Kaplan demonstrations sees that many people from the 73 war who served in the tanks divisions are present there as a group. This has nothing to do with politics, but you will always see them present there. General Amidror is speaking. People take advantage of their statement. It has nothing to do with 73. I think that it has to do something with 73, because there is a saying, if they fought during the Yom Kippur War in 73, that gives them a special position. You can be for it or against it, but they are a specific group. No, but this is not the point. The saying is that all 73 war fighters unite in Kaplan. Let's calm down. It doesn't mean that all fighters of 73 have the same position concerning the civilian political situation today. The idea is that being a fighter in 73 is something that puts you in a bit of a special situation. And that's why, in fact, I tried to finish our conversation with that, this conversation about the line drawn between the army and the people, and what exactly the Yom Kippur War changed in that equation. It is true that today the military space is not only the only one for a war. We are now at the moment where the civilian challenges are also very big. Thank you very much, Dr. Idit Shafran. And now, a researcher in INSS, senior researcher. Everyone wants me to be short. I will decide while talking. First of all, when they asked me to talk about imprisonment, I jumped on the occasion. It's true that in the beginning I said no, but I accepted later because this is important to me. In the last 10 years, I've been very much busy with imprisonment, coming back to normal life after imprisonment. You probably remember the 2 days we conducted about imprisonment. Time spent in prison, we'll talk about that. The story of being imprisoned is a story of small numbers, but it's a very significant problem from the human point of view in Israeli society. If we look at the, I'll try to run through history. Again, we have the pre-Yom Kippur period and the post-Yom Kippur period, war period. In the independence, or during the independence, there were many prisoners of war. Many people remember Abba Kovner talked about it, and Abba Kovner saw it almost as treason. Then we know about Uri Ilan, people who were prisoners in Syria. Ghibli, for those who remember, from the 101 unit. And then we had one prisoner in the War of Kadesh. And then in the Six-Day War, we had pilots who were prisoners and were exchanged quite quickly. And then we had those of the parasha of the story. And then in the Retribution War, our prisoners sat for 3.5 years. during the War of Attrition. And then we get to the Yom Kippur War. And the Yom Kippur War is special for many reasons, and also due to the big number, hundreds of prisoners. And that situation became part of the trauma the country was in. It has some very special characteristics, and it represents a big change. First of all, they did not talk. They came as if we're in front of treason. Many thought that the fact that they surrendered was an act of treason. When you look at the movie lately done and called Mezach, you see the details of this feeling. They come back to a country where horrible things have happened. Some of my friends who were prisoners, they come back to a country. After the Six-Day War, people, prisoners who came back were simply surprised to find a glorious, victorious people, and no one asked them about their experience. On the contrary, after they came back, the prisoners of the Yom Kippur War did not talk at all. They did not report their experiences, and only years later did they start to talk, because there were special traumas. They lived different traumas. And we see the special characteristics of being a prisoner with personal traumatic experiences in the Yom Kippur War. They are very deeply touched, and of course everyone is trying to help them, but it is a lifelong experience. They die earlier. There is an influence on the second and even third generation for such people, like the Shoah. In fact, the same characteristics as the Holocaust, but of course in much, much smaller numbers. And of course, proper treatment is offered. And now researchers have been also read widely in the world. The fact is that the Ministry of Defense doesn't really want to talk much about this situation. This is something that we have met in many Yom Kippur prisoners, war prisoners. And now we're talking about a change. After the Yom Kippur War, 40 days more or less was the period of imprisonment in Egypt. In Syria it was 3.5 months, and then we are in front of terror organizations in the years that followed the Yom Kippur War. There are prisoners at the hands of Jibril, of Al-Fatah, and of course, after that, Hezbollah, Hamas, and all that. In fact, I believe that when you analyze something now, because of lack of time, I'm looking at bird's view, when you check the Israeli position and the way you behave in front of the war prisoners, you see very clearly what brought to the Shalit deal, I call it the Netanyahu deal, in which a right government, the one of Bibi, I told Boogie Alon, you were in the government, even though you opposed it. The society and the way it looks at the situation, we are talking about give and take with terrorist organizations. There is no doubt. It is true to think that in case you free terrorists, you enforce them. The fact is that the terrorists who have been liberated are not those who are the worst, those who killed many people. In 2006, a new expression has been formed. It means the terrorist organization specifically try to make prisoners in order to use them against the enemy. The Shamgar Committee has decided, and its decision has not been published. We know that those who have read the report or what the press published about them, they say that there must be a proportional consideration in matters of freeing prisoners from the terrorist organizations. The quantity of terrorists you liberate should be a limited one, and when we talk about corpses, the proportion should also be not too big. I mean, not to return too many corpses for just for one corpse. The government, when they try to tie the hands of a government, this is a field in which this can be very easily accomplished. I want to say that this is a very difficult situation, and we cannot behave like America. The United States is free in fact, the situation of promising and dealing with terrorist organizations, but you should not tie the hands of the government with principles that are not applicable, even though if they look right ones. Imagine how we should have, if something happened and we really had a situation in which we had to deal with terrorist organizations, when in Rafiah almost 7 people were caught and made prisoners. To finish, I would like to suggest the following. I want to finish by saying that in the coming wars, if there are any wars, let's hope there will be none. It is clear, no doubt, that if something happens in the north, the situation, imagine what would happen. There will be a possibility that something will be, that an incursion will be in the north or fighting inside Lebanon, and will have to confront the necessity to free prisoners, Israeli prisoners, and the give and take will be with terrorist organizations. I don't know if it will be with countries, but this is something that we must really consider. It is important from value-wise. In spite of the small numbers, it has a very big importance. Thank you.
So thank you, Yoram Schweitzer. And now, Reservist General Yaakov Amidror will come to take this podium. We'll talk about various lessons learned for the build-up of power. Former head of the National Council of Security and a senior fellow of JISS, I'm sorry, do not get confused, absolutely not the same place. No, they will not get confused with ISS. No, people do actually, the logo is quite similar. They will not get confused, don't you worry. I'm sorry, unfortunately I have to finish at that point. Time-wise, that's the schedule. And I actually told the organizers that it's too late. I don't want to get into quarrel, but my colleague Tamir Reiman talked about the National Council of Security and the Cabinet, and those two things are very dear to my heart, and I think we need a whole day dedicated to this topic because the Cabinet is not the commander of the military, and the word commander doesn't belong to the whole relationship between the political rank and the military rank. So the cabinet shouldn't be professional. Indeed, the other way around, it should not be professional. It should be of the elected ones, those who are not professionals. And it should not command over the military. Even the great Churchill never had overruling of the head of staff and the general staff during the Second World War. And the matter of national security is not the military. The military is just an important part, but definitely not to work on the field that we work with. So we have our own part in this to help and to develop things that the military doesn't do. They should never do what the military has to do. And Tamir is obviously, he's one of the leading experts because of his tremendous experience. He's being confused. Probably we have to dedicate a whole day of theoretical discussions to the Cabinet and the Council of National Security to understand the difference between the ranks and what is their role. Look differently from significant part of those who work here. Don't want to talk about strategy. I want to say a few words about the war. I was in this war in the Division 1922 that fought in the south. But I don't want to talk at all about the personal experience that I had. It's completely irrelevant in my age. I want to say, I have two comments about the system of the political rank and the military rank and how did it look. During this particular war, those who commanded of the military were the last commanders that fought during the War of Independence, majority of them the Palmach, by the way. So the respect they had and the level of trust that the political rank had in them was a result in many sense of the very similar worldview of reality. Helped tremendously to the relationship between the political and the military rank. As is completely different from the current state of affairs. Between the political rank, not just during those current particular snapshot of the reality, but in other incarnations and the military rank, there's a completely different level of relationships and trust that existed on the eve of the Yom Kippur War. It's a different level of trust that we face today. The second comment that I have, so the commanders that were during this war came with a lot of experience in the battlefield. Some of them started it during the Second World War, accumulated then during the War of Independence, the Kadesh operation, the 67, all of them, almost all of them. And then they come to the eve of the new Yom Kippur War. And I think that in the foundations of the ability of those commanders to recover out of the first 10 days was this military experience. They saw a few things on the battlefield that were as horrid as what happened during the first 10 days. Some broke down, of course, some didn't. I don't want to get into it, but I'm actually saying that the current general staff is very different. They have absolutely no experience in the battlefield. And the question is, how do you prepare a general staff for a war that when everyone in the general staff have no actual competent experience, This is a very challenging question. And MacArthur actually answered that in his during the First World War. Well, they didn't have an experience, of course, and well, Indians. He came to fight. He said, "I read everything written in English about wars. So now decide yourself whether we as a military read books about everything that happened during wars, only that's written in Hebrew. Let's forget about what's written in English." So as MacArthur's memoir said, you needed hands-on experience. Bar-Lev will be saving 2 directorates, by the way. It was very well felt during the Southern Directorate. So when you have to test your experience in the fire of war, it had to handle it without an experience, obviously, and you had to take the former chief of staff in order to stabilize the situation, because the directorates found it really hard to cope, to stabilize the north and to save the south, basically. And how do you raise the senior commanders in the military that has no actual competent experience is a significant question, and it's a very challenging one. It's a hard one. So the Yom Kippur War, there is a significant experience role in the field of combat. So we need to think about that in a different manner. So you can learn so many lessons. Conventional deterrence. The conventional deterrence is the very, very problematic thing. 6 years after the most successful war of the State of Israel, the Six-Day War, afterwards, there is an attrition war, and after the Yom Kippur War, but where's the deterrence? Where did it go? Those who talk about conventional deterrence have to understand that the Yom Kippur War is always a private study case, but it's really a prominent one, that deterrence on the conventional level is very problematic. You can never predict how efficient will it be, only in hindsight. Non-conventional deterrence, a lot of doctrines, but on conventional deterrence, I think we should be very cautious. Secondly, everyone talks about the element of operational surprise, reconnaissance surprise. I don't want to talk about that because many did before me. I just want to say it wasn't gathering of the reconnaissance that brought us to a surprise. It was actually the assessment of the analysis, human assessment, I would say, 27 years. And Meir is my teacher and my commander. I came to the role of the research division commander, and you don't have a way to prevent it from happening. But there was also an operational surprise, an operational surprise of a really heavy grade and very complex one. During the first week, we surprised ourselves with the very low level of performance of our military, and we're quite surprised by the high level of performance of the Egyptian army. I left Sinai a year and a half before the war, and I remember how we treated the possibility of the Egyptians and our possibilities if we'll come to a conflict and confrontation. And the question is, again, how did it happen to us? And I think that the answer to this question is, in fact, in the end, is in-depth question, really. The army is a profession. Being a military man is a profession, it's not a mission. Well, in order to join the military, you need this mission. But the military is a profession, and you need to study that. And in this war, I think, we proved that in many points of time, those people might have significant experience, but their professional level is not sufficient. I'm not disrespecting, obviously, the spirit and the unity and the commanding capabilities, but again, there is one professional test, and I have 3 examples of very professional decisions that have absolutely no ideology, nothing. I commented what I commented because, and I like that in this institute and almost in all of the events, you always bring those who are against the reform and never allow those who support the reform to express their opinions. I think it's not okay that in such a place you do not completely exempt those who refuse to serve with all those beautiful words, whatever they call themselves. That's why I actually said what I said before. I would like to give you examples without any ideological matter. As a military example, by the way, not necessarily made by the military. Maybe it was a political rank they gave it, and we just so that the touch line is the line of halt would never be ratified by any military academy. No one would accept the program that the contact point is also the point of halt, and it was a decision of the State of Israel. We will be defending on the half peninsula of Sinai up to Sinai. canal, Suez Canal. That was a decision made way before the war began. So does not comply with any professional criteria. I'm saying that because maybe in the future we'll be facing problems of that sort in some places. You don't have a choice. In the north, versus settlements, for example, you don't have a choice, probably. But one has to understand the initial assumption in any beginning of a defense lines studies that the contact point will be broken through. You can't build a program where you say, okay, I cannot prevent it from happening. The whole military experience proves that it's impossible. And secondly, when the war began, one of the lessons of the Six-Day War, to my great surprise, I didn't believe it after I saw it, they don't need artillery, because the Air Force is a flying artillery against any human experience in warfare. Any sort of aid within those units should take into account that it won't be functional. And if you believe on an external aid, which in this case the Air Force, and when it has to go to the south, it will not prioritize artillery, when it's absolutely known that any defense program, artillery is the force number one that you have, because it's only flexible enough to work in different sectors. You don't have to go anywhere. From one place you can hit many different spots, and you can coordinate and concentrate fire from many places into one place if it becomes problematic. Artillery received absolutely no prioritization. And today as well, artillery in the IDF doesn't receive enough of prioritization. Wrong lesson. If you think that precision-guided weapons is a substitute to artillery of regular nature, big mistake. Requires completely different type of warfare, different type of thinking, different type of reconnaissance. The whole topic of artillery is completely a mess. It was during the Yom Kippur War, and it still does not receive a proper expression today. And the most painful one is a counter-attack on the 8th of October. It's my painful example. In the south, yes, I talk about the south, pardon me. That's a good comment. If we would have operated based on what is written in our own books, forget about other books, our books, what was written there, everything would look completely different. Everything would look completely different, and again, maybe probably the whole war would have unfolded in completely different. I'm following Manuel. I don't want to say it could have been, I don't want to be as extreme as he was. Look, it's an ABC of any attack. You need to concentrate your power. As Motke said in the past, the main effort is not strong enough. It should be stronger. The IDF decides to go into offensive. They decide to attack. They have 3 different divisions. He transferred to one of the divisions, and this division doesn't attack. It actually goes in battalions, one after another. In the place where they needed 2 divisions at least, there is just 1 battalion that couldn't really pass through. It's not a random decision that someone can actually make. Again, if you would put it on the table based on the books we have, if you put such a program in the commanding officer college, you would say, okay, you failed the class. But in the battlefield, that's what happened. So the program itself is ratified by the Chief of Staff at the Southern Directorate without any assessment of the current state of affairs. They didn't have the enemy on the map, only our forces. Someone told me that. And Mount Sakel, in his book, he was the brigade commander in this division. The confusion in orders and plans of the counter-effects were unprecedented. The confusion. This is basic. That was a foundation. It shouldn't happen in a professional military. That we will always make mistakes during the warfare. Everyone does it. If you think that you can have a perfect war without mistakes, you don't know what war is. There's no such thing without making an error, but there are basic things in the process that if you do those things, you will diminish the number of mistakes you will be making, their size and their scale. So it was on the level of command of the Chief of Staff and the performance in the field. Battalion after battalion went where they needed 2 divisions. Obviously, it couldn't succeed. Charlie wrote, the enemy continued stubbornly to sacrifice their tanks and human lives in tactics with small doses of charging of them. Cavalry. You can see that actually studied the Crimea War, and he studied the Second World War on the Polish front. So the understanding that the professional matters that you actually have to use in order to operate. It's very difficult to introduce into the system that is not professional by nature. And unfortunately, in this sense, we have a lot to learn. So the last lesson, an additional lesson I would like to touch upon here, is one of the greatest successes that is not getting enough of that attention, unfortunately. The logistics in the war was not good. It was impeccable. I don't know whether people know that every night they amended hundreds of tanks all over Israel. Every night they fixed hundreds of tanks. So basically the idea fought when each tank was hit more than once or twice because the whole logistics system kicked in and all the tanks were fixed during the night after they were hit during the day, and they were back to the battlefield. If you would calculate statistics, apparently we had a bigger military because those tanks fought after they were hurt already, and they were hit and they go back. So the system collapsed. The most extreme example is 188, where all the commanding rank were killed. It seems that all the brigade commanders were wounded at that point, but the logistics continued to operate. It came to the platoon commanders in the field, provided them with fuel and ammunition, continued to fight. So forget about the fact that they didn't collapse under the very fact they didn't have anyone commanding over them, but the logistics continued to work. And I think that it was definitely one of the amazing examples we should study, and not to ruin it by some kind of hasty decisions of how the logistics system should look during war. And what about Scorpio axis in the south? Okay, saying that was exposed during the middle of the war in the desert, let's say that they shoot during warfare. Yeah, it's the same. You need to understand in the area where you can't really deploy on the whole territory, and since I traveled through this axis when it was blocked, and it will happen. There's no way of solving this problem. When you want to move a large military on one axis, you can't deploy in the sides. So this particular axis, called the spider axis, was exposed. It's not logistics, actually. It's not supposed to be planned by logistics. We don't have a transportation system. That should be managed by the military police, the way in the military they do. In normal military, there is a military police that manages the transportation axis. So those axes will continue to be exposed because we don't have such a mechanism. It's a different structure of the military that's required, but it's a different story, in fact. But logistics continued to operate regardless. The spider axis, that was blocked, by the way. They arrived, they continued to flow everything that one needed in the battlefield. And the Pond Bridge, Pond Bridge received the award of the Israel Security Award, but was the last to arrive. I was at the other side in the commanding room, but then they hit the bridge. I said, okay, what's the problem? Just have a little bridge on the gap that existed and continue to run. You saw how in a minute someone actually found a solution. And it's an additional lesson that received an importance after the changes of Chief of Staff of Rabbi Chavi. So the Air Force, without an accurate reconnaissance, is like a blind animal. No Air Force can function without an exact and good reconnaissance. That even more than then in 73, now it's even more acute than that because we have precision-guided weapons, and some places they don't have an ability to work without precision-guided weapons. This whole matter of how to operate when you do not generate equality, superiority in the airborne space. How do you operate when the reconnaissance on the anti-air batteries of the enemy is inaccurate? Well, obviously, how do you deploy? How you so that the Chinese farm? No, since I was present actually in the spot, there was a completely different story there. What happened at the Chinese farm, if you want to really divert from the Uzi area landed with the helicopters, and Dovik was briefing him. He briefed him. Brim was not there. I think he was asleep at that point, and the problem was the time. Not the reconnaissance. One could have get a better reconnaissance, but they would have said, okay, we have 3 hours to get ready. Now go to the field after the briefing. And that was a fact, really. I told Uzi and his intelligence officer, Tzoref, that we don't have time. Uzi told me we don't have time. So we didn't have an exact reconnaissance, but if we would have it, what they had was a problem of time, and it happens all the time during warfare. It's unavoidable. They can't solve it. There will always be this tension between the need to prepare and to be better prepared, and the need of we need to do it as fast as possible. It's too late. It's just not worth the effort. So again, we could have done so many things, but you could have done so many things, but what actually happened there was a tension between the time, because they received an order to do that and to try to dedicate an hour to learn the field was an unknown terrain. Guys, listen again, this dialogue again. Listen, but listen well. It's a real shame, really. So it's war, not what has happened in Nablus. It's a complete and total chaos. War is a complete and total chaos. And when you tell one and it didn't come to the third party, it will always happen. They didn't transfer the information he received to someone else. Don't reach conclusions based on those facts. Talia asked me about the question, so I clarified. There was just tension between time and ability. If you have 2 hours to prepare, maybe think that Gil David, who was my platoon commander in 202, would Gil David heard from Natan Shumari, maybe it would reach the destination. There was no time, not even time to clarify what exactly about to do and where. But this is where you need to go, that's it. Okay, because there was insane pressure. I'm not judging it really, I'm not even saying that. I'm not sure whether it was correct or not under those circumstances. Well, if it would have been just a lieutenant who doesn't even understand the lingo, but obviously, how you connect the Air Force to the intelligence and to the needs of land forces as an important legacy of Aviv Kochavi, and one should not be confused. Because during campaign between wars, even the reconnaissance and the Air Force look completely differently. But when it's war and not a campaign between wars, when things are moving very fast, it's a very challenging question. And the last lesson, it's a general one really. One of the things that we learned from this war, again, I was in the Division 62. It was that the armed corps division, the strongest part of land force, it should have been very well organized, right? The war is dictated very often, is decided during the force buildup. And when you get to the warfare, it's very difficult to fix mistakes done during the force build-up through implementation of this force. So we need to give much more respect in the military, I think, to those who build up this force, because they will dictate the fate of war even before the war began. Because after it's beginning, in many cases, it's too late. To such an extent, it's correct that the French usually divided generals between the force build-up generals and implementing generals. It's a completely different way of thinking. And this is a different way of thinking where we need to give a lot of respect to those who build up this force, because war is decided by them. Those are the main lessons that I wanted to present to you intentionally. I didn't drill to the strategic, I didn't zoom out on the strategic level, but I wanted to focus on the military matters, because wars, listen, it's difficult to learn. No war will be similar to a previous one, it's very clear, but there is no way to prepare yourself for future wars without learning the wars of the past. And how within this tension, in this range, how can we learn about the wars of the past and to understand that the next war will be completely different? It's a challenging question of years and years of those who live in the military try to unravel. It's a very important part of the work of the commanders, how to learn the past and to prepare for the future, knowing it will look differently, but it's the best way to learn. One of the good things that happened, that the frameworks were preserved. I'm sorry, I cannot hear the speaker because he's not using the microphone. It's a fascinating topic. How they managed to preserve those frameworks without commanders, and how the commanders managed to preserve frameworks when there were no frameworks. Division 14 is an example when the framework was completely battled and there were hit constantly really hard, but the commander managed to last. But the whole commanding rank of a different division disappeared and vanished, but the system continued to function. This is definitely proves the amazing level of unity of the forces of those units, and the topic of unity, obviously, or under fire, is not a trivial matter as well, and unsolved easily, really. Definitely one of the most important efforts of the commanders during war.